So we're often told that life is an illusion and that we don't know ourselves truly, that life is a non-duality, that separation doesn't exist, that all of this is the illusion that is not reality. And in some teaching paths, the methodology is to point at reality or truth, which essentially is a pointing towards our true nature, is how it is framed. So it is a movement away from ignorance towards truth, a movement away from not knowing ourselves towards knowing ourselves. And the knowing that is spoken about is referred to as a direct knowing, not a knowing of outside object that we have an understanding of from an outside perspective, but a much more direct knowledge, a much more direct understanding. And that understanding, that knowledge is often emphasized as not being intellectual, not being something of the mind. And in order to demonstrate what that means, the teachings will say that it has to be experiential. The knowing is a direct knowing of oneness, an experiential knowing of oneness, and not an intellectual knowing of oneness. So the word knowing, the word understanding, which we ordinarily refer or use in typical English language, we refer to understanding and knowing or knowledge as being something acquired, some new information, and some new understanding about something out there. We have new knowledge about a political system, or new knowledge about an economic system, or new knowledge about how to grow plants. We might have a new understanding about the way that elements in the ground interact with plants, or a new understanding about how the animal kingdom developed. And all of these sorts of understandings or knowing, knowledge, is all additional information. So, because non-duality often talks about direct knowing, or understanding with a capital U, knowing with a capital K, knowledge with a capital K, in order for the intellect to not misunderstand what is being pointed at, there is this emphasis on the knowing, the understanding not being intellectual, but being experiential. And that is trying to point someone away from thinking they understand non-duality, for example. They understand their own nature just because they have an intellectual understanding. Just because they have read something and say, oh, I understand what it's saying. And that's pointed at and repeated so often that a seeker can be excused for thinking that this understanding, this knowledge, this knowing, this direct knowing, which is described as experiential, is about an experience, is about a state, is about a shift, a experiential shift. Why can they be excused for coming to that conclusion? Well, quite simply because of what I've just pointed out. The teachings go to extreme lengths to say this is not the understanding that they are talking about, is not an intellectual understanding. It's about coming to know yourself as yourself. Now, you might know something outside of yourself through perception and through concept. But the whole point is to try and bring about an appreciation and eventually this direct knowing that's saying, how can you know yourself at a distance? It isn't about knowing yourself through a concept of yourself. It isn't about knowing yourself as an object perceived. It's about being yourself. And if you are being yourself, you know yourself as fully, as intimately as you could possibly know anything. When we think about it, it's quite strange to say, I don't know myself. For that notion to exist, to not know yourself. Think, how can you not know yourself or we could say, how can I not know myself? And yet the teachings, the pointers are saying we have forgotten ourselves, we have lost touch with ourselves, we do not know ourselves anymore. And this is a process of rediscovery, a process of self-knowledge, a process of discovering oneself, coming to know oneself fully, coming to be what we always have been. And that's why the movement, and not only the movement, but the resting in being and the way of living is referred to as effortless, as not something we have to keep doing once there is this recognition of ourself and we're grounded there. The consequence, which in the case of this teaching is described as peace of mind, a comfortableness with oneself, a comfortableness with life. That is not something we have to work hard at achieving on an ongoing basis. It is a consequence of being what we are. So it doesn't need us to do extra work. The work that seems to get done is the work in the process of coming to remember, coming to recognize the revelation. There seems to be work needed in order for change to happen. Now, I would emphasize that the work that gets done is not being done by the seeker, but rather life is living the seeker, like it's living all the animals and all the plants and all the other people. We're all being lived. We're all having to overcome obstacles. So a tree may grow according to the amount of sun and water it's given, according to its root systems. And as it's growing, it might come across an obstacle. And it might have to do a lot of extra work to break through the obstacle. Maybe it's a wall or another tree. Maybe it's a rock, and the roots have to make their way through little gaps in the rock, and as they grow bigger, push the rock apart. So you could see that compared to an easy root growth, one tree may have to overcome obstacle and do work to get past certain things. But really that's life living through the tree, and the tree is just doing what the tree does. So it doesn't have the idea of doing work. And so the point here is that the seeker might have to climb mountains, and that is life happening, life living the seeker. So it's very important to not form the idea when I talk about work needs to get done. It gets done, but not by the entity that believes it to be the entity that does everything. That's one of the core principles that teachings are trying to put across, is that life is a non-duality. Life is a singularity. So you must be part of life, because if there was life in you, then that becomes a duality. If there's life in you, then there's separation. You are separate from life. So non-duality, non-separation, essentially means not separate from life, means part of life. And so unless you believe that you control life, if the notion of non-separation sinks in, even if we just start thinking about it and we say, okay, non-separation, non-duality means there is just life, or just this. And I am part of that. So if I'm part of that and not separate from it, how can I be a separate, independent, autonomous doer that is making my life happen according to my will? That is the attitude, the understanding, or maybe misunderstanding, that gets put in place when we don't see ourselves as part of life, when we don't see life as this all-encompassing movement that very much includes the movement of the human being. So if that's our attitude, that we are separate from life, then our idea of ourselves is of being a separate, independent, autonomous entity making my life happen. And so my life is then different from your life, because with the attitude that there is life and then there is me, means there's life, there's me, and then there's the other, the many others. And so we look at, we've suddenly created lots of separation. There's my life, there's your life, there's his life, her life, their life, and then life in general, which must mean life except for the human lives. And so we've created all of this separation where in fact maybe none exists. And so the separation in life that is spoken about as being an error by non-dual teachings might actually be speaking about a way of seeing the one that creates a psychological separation, when in fact that separation in the way we think about it doesn't exist. And the end of separation may in fact mean the falling away of that attitude, or the falling away of that way of seeing my life, the other's life, and seeing me as separate from life. So the end of separation may just be the changing of the perspective. Now, the question is that what a lot of seekers understand separation and the end of separation to mean? And I would say no. If a seeker on the non-dual path who has been listening to the descriptions, especially the descriptions that say this understanding, this knowing, is not intellectual. It has to be experiential. Would most likely form the belief, and then a belief that is further solidified by certain experiences very much happening, very much being available to the seeker and the human being in general. The belief is reinforced by certain experiences that seem to confirm the experiential understanding that is spoken about. The belief gets put in place even further. So what belief is that? I'm suggesting that if we ask the non-dual seeker, what do you think the end of separation is? And I am very confident to say that because of a whole lot of factors, it's very understandable that the belief is, oh, the end of separation will be an experience of oneness. And when I'm using the word experience, I'm using it loosely because within certain teachings, experience, the word experience, is reserved for what we know life as prior to any realization of oneness. So the word experience is reserved for the type of experience that we could say is fairly normal in life, where there is a sense that I am this body-mind organism, this object, and we go through life observing life as an objective reality and seeing objects outside of myself. So that's referred to as experience, because in that use of or when the word experience is used in that context, it means there is an experiencer having an experience. An experiencer means the subject that is separate from the object experienced. And so, in fact, if we were being more technical, if I was going to be technical, the seeker that has become convinced that the end of separation is not intellectual, and has therefore assumed it is experiential, might not even agree with the notion that it is an experience, because the word has been specifically used to denote subject-object relationship. An experience where there is the sense of a subject that is separate from the object perceived. And there very much is a shift in the way that life, let's use that. Eventually I'd like to come back to use the word experience, because let me make it clear, I don't use the word experience limited to the experience of life where there is a subject-object relationship. I use the word experience to describe anything known or anything experienced. There isn't a better word, it's a beautiful word, experience. I use the word experience to describe anything experienced in life, including the most profound feeling, peak states or experiences. The reason that the confusion comes in is because the top-down esoteric teachings that are pointing at this are using a very specific strategy, in a way, to rewire the brain such that it renders a different experience. The brain needs to be rewired because it has been hardwired up to date by us seeing life and experiencing ourselves a certain way. And so the teachings need to create a different way of us perceiving, a different way about us thinking about life. And the most effective way is to call the old way illusion, unreal, ignorance, misunderstanding. And to label that which is not seen, not known, to label that which we are seeking, which is available and one day where we might come to know, as truth, as reality, as what we really are, as the self with a capital S. And on the other side, there is the self with a small s. The teachings will label duality as experience, misunderstanding, ignorance, maya, illusion, unreal, and non-duality, non-separation as truth, as real, as reality. And so in so doing, a motivation is created, because intuitively what we are, even what we are when certain misunderstanding exists, is as real as it's going to get. The essence of what we are, even that essence is there, and we are in touch with it. Maybe we don't recognize it, but it's there even when misunderstanding is there. So intuitively, because this sense of I, the essence of the human being, that is, which is what we are even when we don't realize it, because that's about as true as things get in the manifestation in life, there is this intuitive movement towards truth and away from the false. Intuitive movement towards the real rather than the unreal. An intuitive movement towards that which is not error or not ignorance. Now, that might be a combination of the sense that the self is as true a component in the manifestation, and it can also be a consequence of our intellect wanting pleasure and not pain, wanting good and not bad, wanting to be right and not wrong. So that can be an ego-based bias towards truth, towards reality, towards that which we really are, and an ego pushing away of that which we are not. So if that is the case, then the teachings are using to their advantage that which exists, that entity that exists. Using to the advantage the motivation that that entity has for something over something else. Real versus unreal. Oh, I'll take the real, says the egoic movement that has divided everything into duality, wanting one half of duality and not the other half. And once that is established, this movement towards the real, having set it up as what we are and what we can realize ourselves as, a certain type of thinking is categorized under the unreal, under the ignorance side of things. In fact, all thinking is categorized under the ignorance category. And there's a very important reason why that happens, because the teaching is trying to create a shift in the way the world is rendered, a shift such that the world is not perceived exclusively through thought. And the brain has developed in such a way that it interprets everything that it becomes aware of. And in doing that, in saying, oh, that's a table, and that's a chair, and that's another person, because all of these things have been shown to us as little kids, pictures of a dog and a flower and a table and a chair and a person, a mother and a father. And words have been attributed to that object. So from a very young age, we have learnt to label everything as separate objects through the use of language. And language essentially is words. And words are many. And they're separate. You can pull a word out of a hat. And by pulling out cat, you don't necessarily pull out dog. So they are separate words. That means we come to know the world through language, through thought. And we, in a way, stop knowing the table. Because as soon as the table is seen, which is prior to thinking, it gets labeled with our language, which is loaded based on our experience. And on top of that, we then will judge the table as being a table we like, we don't like, and all sorts of other limiting descriptions of what is. And in that labeling, because the labeling is done relative to me, the judgment is relative to me. Is that useful to me? Is the way the room is laid out, is that useful to me? And without us knowing, our thinking puts in place a psychological me that doesn't have to be how we know ourselves, doesn't have to be the way the world is perceived and understood. And yet, that way of perceiving the world through language and having ideas about oneself, which is all language, a certain sense of self gets put in place, and the world then is seen as being good or bad relative to that idea of ourself. And if that way of relating to life isn't challenged in one way or another, it continues to function, and we might be seeking an understanding of ourself as described. We might be seeking an understanding of life differently without realizing that the main movement that keeps what is being referred to as ignorance in place hasn't been addressed. So if we're waiting for non-duality to make sense, and yet our thinking remains unchallenged, our way of processing life remains unchallenged, then we can get very frustrated. We will get frustrated because we'll be absorbing the teachings that are talking about non-separation and oneness, talking about it has to be known outside of the intellect. And without us realizing it, whenever we look at anything, the intellect is firing up, and we're not realizing it because it's functioning in such a background manner, in such an automatic and consistent manner, that we don't see the intellect when we are looking around at life. We don't understand that the intellect is functioning. And for that reason, we don't understand why a new sense of self isn't presenting. And in simple terms, it's because the old sense of self is being maintained on a very fundamental level by our labeling of life, by language, which is all linked to thought. So language doesn't exist without the thought of language. So language and our thinking are not two. Thinking is language, and language is our thinking. As we start to look at life without labeling, which requires us to have a certain insight about the fact that we automatically label things. And as we have an insight into the fact that we automatically label things because of the way we have developed, because of the way language has been put in place, and the way the experience of life tends to be of time and space and separate objects, and that is aided by, or that is emphasized by, the fact that there is so much differentiation in the life experience. There are so many different forms, different objects, so there seems to be separation. That's why our language labels things as different from each other. And I'm not saying that there isn't difference. One thing is different from the other. And we tend to see it on the surface level, and that's where the main difference is on the surface level. And so from a young age, we have had an experience of life being life of many objects that are different from each other, and the language is set in place. And so the teachings need to come in and tell us that life is radically different to the way we know it. They need to tell us that we don't know life truly, we don't know ourself truly, because a hypnosis has come over us. A hypnosis that has created separation. What you are, the teachings will say, is formless awareness. You are not a body. And the whole world, the whole universe, which really is pointing to the whole world universe as it arises in your present moment experience. The whole world, the whole universe arises inside what you are, arises in the formless awareness that you are. And this is described as reality. This is truth. And knowing life the way we have come to know life, as subject-object relationship, duality, knowing oneself as physical and a separate object to all the other objects, is described as the not knowing. And a series of very well crafted pointers are delivered to interfere with our thinking and our perception of life as we've always known it. So for those of you who may not be particularly familiar with the teaching that I normally put forward, and even for those who are, in case you haven't realized it, what I'm putting forward is a teaching from a different perspective to what I would normally say, a different set of concepts. And I would like to work it round so that by using a juxtaposition, it starts to become clear about what each teaching is trying to achieve, and maybe allow us to see where the common ground is and appreciate the importance of both teachings and see that they are appropriate at different phases of the seeking. Because what can happen is we can come across teachings that say radically different things. And as a seeker, it makes sense that we're going to get very confused. What does it mean? Well, why does one teaching say this and another teaching say that? And we think, I can't reconcile them. They're so different. Which one is true? And then even if we say, okay, I'm going to work with this one, but we might wonder, what does this really mean within this teaching? I can interpret it 3 or 4 different ways, or maybe just 2 different ways, and I'm not sure which way it means. So by juxtaposing 2 approaches, it might start to become more evident what is meant. So at the moment, I started off talking about how we can easily come to think that liberation is about an experiential state of oneness, because the teachings are often telling us that it is not intellectual, it is experiential. Now, what does experiential mean? Because it could mean different things and still fit into the category of experiential or direct, as opposed to intellectual. And so I was suggesting that if we come to see life as being life, and not me and life, then there can be a realization that I am not separate from life. Does that require a oneness experience to be present for that understanding to have gone beyond an intellectual understanding to something that is understood directly? And then once again, what does directly mean? Understood directly. Does that not mean a oneness experience? If we're saying, well, what you're suggesting is an understanding that the person is not separate from life, and to know that deeply, beyond an intellectual understanding. Doesn't that mean a oneness experience? Knowing yourself not separate from life. And I'm suggesting it doesn't equate to, it is not synonymous with a oneness experience. To know yourself as part of life, can that knowing beyond the intellect, beyond a question of doubt, can that exist when the experience is not an experience of oneness? So I'm sure someone listening will say, that's a contradiction. How can you know beyond an intellectual understanding that you are not separate from life and yet not have a oneness experience? And so this is exactly the point I'm getting at, is the assumption is that the non-separation or the falling away of separation means the emergence of a oneness experience where there is experientially no sense of separation. And I know, so I have to say this, otherwise someone will say, oh, he doesn't understand. This is what I said to in my head about Ramesh when he referred to the state that I knew well as a state where there was a sense of oneness, an experiential state of oneness, where there was no subject-object relationship. When I described that to Ramesh, he said, Roger, don't worry about it. That is just experience. And I couldn't resonate with that because to me, it wasn't just experience, it was non-duality. It was the culmination of years of investigating and self-inquiry such that certain experiential senses of separation fell away. And so when that happened, and the teachings are talking about the end of separation, not intellectual but experiential, the end of subject-object relationship, how can you not assume, and it doesn't even seem like an assumption, how can you not believe, and it doesn't seem like a belief, that that state of oneness, that falling away of subject-object relationship is not enlightenment? When the teachings that you might have been immersed in for years and years have said that, have described reality as that which has presented. It just doesn't make sense to question whether that is enlightenment, given that the teachings of enlightenment have emphasized exactly what, at certain points in the seeking process, presents itself experientially. So what I'm suggesting here is that there very much is a state, an experience, and I'm not saying experience in the way that says it will come and go. That's another description that is often linked to the word experience. Oh, it's an experience because it comes and it goes. Because this way of perceiving where there is no subject-object relationship is not something that has to come and go. It is a shift that happens in, I will say, in the brain, such that the life experience that is rendered, the life experience that is created, is created differently to before. And the significant aspect is that the point of awareness, the sense of self, is no longer has the quality of being the body. In the newly created experience, the sense of self has shifted from being and feeling like it is the body that is perceiving life to a new state where there is a sense that life is known by formless awareness. And that state, which can be there when you wake up in the morning and can persist for the whole day and be there when you go to sleep, and can be there when dreams are happening, and can be there even when various states of sleep are taking place. And can be there again the next morning and through the day, and so on a continuous basis for months. And I don't doubt that it could be there for a whole lifetime. And the reason I don't doubt it to be there for a lifetime is because it can persist for months, because it is essentially a training of the body-mind organism to perceive differently, to perceive in a way from a different position. Now we might say, well, how many positions are there to perceive from through the body-mind organism? And the answer is probably very many. I know of at least 2 or 3, because there are different states that we can have. And the reason that there are many different positions to perceive life from is because it is the brain that renders the experience of life, and the position from which it is perceived is heavily dependent on where the brain places the sense of perception within, or how it creates the experience, and where the sense of perception is located, or how it is configured within that particular experience. And so, as part of the top-down teaching approach to create the shift, certain pointers, as I mentioned, pointers are introduced to aid in the shift, to aid in the rewiring of the brain. And one of the pointers is to discourage us from interpreting life as causal, to discourage us from interpreting life as a time-bound reality. And once again, those pointers are allocated to either illusion or reality. So causality, meaning that life happens because A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, is said to be the interpretation of life that is part of illusion. It is not really like that. And time and life being a linear unfolding is also allocated to the unreal side. And spontaneous, non-causal, is allocated to truth side, to reality side. Eternal and timeless is allocated to the reality side. You are the body is allocated to the illusion. You are awareness, in which everything arises, is allocated to truth. The way of labeling everything and always picking one side and knowing the interconnected opposite by default. Like good and bad. Attachment, detachment. Which is all part of language, once again. So that is described as the illusion of duality, and that we exist outside of the dimension of interconnected opposites. So all of these pointers are subtly encouraging our thinking to stop processing life a certain way. So if a story arises about blame, about judgment, about how life should be, the teachings have probably delivered enough pointers for us to say that's not truth, because I'm a story about time, about the past, about the future, about causality, about how they did this and it led to that, and why they did that. So it's all causal thinking in time. And it's all encouraging if we start to see the implications of what the teaching is pointing at and saying, this is illusion and this is reality. The implication is stop doing that. Stop processing life that way. And as we see our stories, our psychological movements are holding on to that way of seeing life, if the motivation is strong enough, if the belief or the trust in the teachings, a healthy trust, is strong enough, if there's a resonance, if there's a faith that yes, what is being said here is leading me in the right direction, then those stories will start getting cut off, and with a simple recognition that is more of illusion. And as the thinking starts to slow down, starts to get cut off, as the labeling stops happening, and we start looking at life without creating artificial barriers between the wall and the shelf and the books and the sun and the sky and the birds and the trees and the grass. As we stop our labeling, we can start to see a vibrancy in life that might not have been there before. We can start to sense a connection, a oneness of the whole thing. And as this thinking and believing ourselves to be the body, or continually reinforcing ourselves to be the body, slows down. So, the teaching will say, you're not the body. So any stories you have about how someone has hurt you we might realize, oh, that was someone hurting the body, and I'm not that, so that story gets cut off. So this is what I'm describing is a seeker that is on the typical, or not necessarily typical, but non-dual, especially the Neo-Advaita, or what is referred to as Neo-Advaita, because Advaita as a whole includes a segment of this, but Advaita is, as it's described in the scriptures and through the specific Advaita teachings, is much broader than the sort of slice that Neo-Advaita has taken. And I have nothing against, I'm not using the word Neo-Advaita as a derogatory term. It's just a recognition of what Neo-Advaita has done. It's taken one slice of Advaita and focused on that because it is deemed to be the most radical or significant shift, let's say. The problem is that Advaita, when it is delivered in its traditional sense, has a lot more parts to it. And so each part is there to essentially balance the whole thing out. And if you take one slice and deliver one slice, it can be very effective at cracking something over, but it might not be very effective at creating a well-rounded effect. But that's not even a problem, because if a seeker finds themselves in a particular teaching that is narrow and doing a very specific job, I have no doubt that something else will come and complement that job once the time is right. So the Neo-Advaita is focusing specifically on what I've been talking about here, which is a rephrasing of life in terms that are radically different to the way that our brain has processed life. And it's for this reason that some seekers on that particular path at that particular phase can seem quite radical, quite extreme, because they are now convincing themselves through repetition, which is how it needs to happen. We often deepen an understanding in ourselves by bouncing it off people, by repeating it to ourselves, and continually reminding ourselves to see life a certain way. And in a way, we're in a war against the old way of seeing. A war within ourselves to convince ourselves that that is not how life is seen, and that the reality is very different. The reality is actually completely different to the way that life has been interpreted and experienced. So it's very much like a movement of rebellion against something that we have come to see as restricting us. So an example could be of an adult, a person who was brought up in a very strict and disciplinary environment where they were given very little latitude and very few freedoms. They had to do exactly as they were told. They weren't given a voice, and parents were very strict with a lot of rules and shoulds and shouldn'ts. And usually that tends to be aggressive or be received as aggression towards a child that is growing and wanting to explore and wanting to allow a natural movement to happen. It can feel very aggressive. And if this is realized at a later stage in life, where the adult might release a lot of hatred or anger towards a parent or a family unit for creating an environment like this, and as that is released, it becomes very obvious that that was an unfortunate situation to be in. And so the parent can swing to the opposite extreme. And swinging to the opposite extreme is essentially a rebellion against that which we have grown up in, as part of letting it go, as part of removing it from the system. And when we move from one extreme to the other extreme, it isn't balanced. It can be very useful. It is useful. That is the methodology. It is the way that the deeply ingrained gets uprooted. And so you can have a parent that allows their kid to do whatever they like in restaurants, climbing on tables, running on the, playing hide and seek under tables, eating off people's plates, shouting loudly, crying, banging things around. And the parent has a rule in their head that I am going to let my children run free. I'm never going to control them. And that is the counter opposite of being controlled. In time, hopefully that adjusts itself and the parent starts to realize from their own experience with the child that there are problems with taking that stance. They'll start to see behavioral issues in the child and then realize that maybe there is some place for some discipline delivered a particular way, and a middle ground can be found. And that middle ground is actually devoid of either of the extremes. It isn't bringing both of the extremes together. It isn't even moderating both the extremes. When we apply discipline with an understanding, it's a different discipline to that discipline. And when we apply freedom with an understanding, it's a different freedom to that extreme. So a balancing out happens. And in the same way, when we're uprooting these ideas of labeling life and seeing life as causality and knowing ourselves as a body, that process happens through us swinging to a counter opposite. And so when we're on that counter opposite, anyone who is anywhere other than on that same position seems to be completely wrong, because essentially we are rebelling, which is not freedom at all. It isn't disconnection. It is complete connection to that which we are rebelling against. It might seem like I am free of it, but actually there's the complete opposite of freedom from it. There is complete resistance to it in favor of its counter opposite. And so if anyone sees life differently to how we're seeing it in that particular phase, they are vehemently wrong, absolutely wrong. They haven't seen the truth. And so my experience is that when people are in that stage, it is such a unique blend. It's like the perfect storm of creating the strongest beliefs that I've come across within spiritual seeking. In a way, the strongest spiritual ego is in place when that's happening. And yet, to me, it's completely understandable. And it's not a tragedy, because what is being dismantled is a particular, or what comes from the dismantling is a particular way of seeing life that can be very beneficial for what needs to come afterwards. And if I come across someone in that position who is too wedded to their position, because I know that their experience has changed, and so a lot of what they're saying is from a shift in the way that life is rendered, and I know that they have been told that that is reality and truth, and that the other is ignorance and misunderstanding. And so what they might be hearing from me or anyone else is something different from what their experience is saying, so they are convinced that they are grounded in truth, seated in reality, and no one else knows. And so the resistance that they have is the same resistance to the counter opposite of, let's say, the parent who is now raising a child with complete freedom. It's the same resistance that that parent has towards discipline. And that will in time change because it won't deliver freedom. And the seeker will feel that at some point. It's like, okay, my experience has shifted and yet something is missing. This can't be what liberation is about. So if one finds a seeker in that position and there isn't a willingness on their part, which is not their doing, it's just the way the structure is set up, to hear the pointers, it's like, okay, let's give it another 3 months, which means I just let time do the work. No need to go in and try and fight a losing battle, because it will be a losing battle. Allow time to show up any inconsistencies, and there will be inconsistencies because that actually isn't a knowing of truth. Of course, one can forgive very easily the seeker for believing it is, because as I said, the teachings that are wanting to bring about this shift, because that shift is a very important shift, have to adopt guerrilla tactics in a way to do the job. And one of those guerrilla tactics is to suggest that that is reality, that that is truth, that that is knowing. Whereas in fact, I'm suggesting that it is a phase towards liberation, towards truth. And I'm completely in awe of those teachings for the fact that they have understood the makeup of the suffering mind so well that they have been able to deliver a set of concepts, a methodology, a teaching that can break through. So in a way, that's something that even medicine and science, with all of the advances that we've had in human evolution, our technology hasn't come close enough yet, anywhere close to understanding how to really rehabilitate the human. And spiritual teachings, by and large, have understood it much better. So I've been jumping around a little bit here without making any specific point, but I feel that this is a difficult topic to broach and go from A to Z. So my hope is in talking about it, hopefully there is a sense of my appreciation for it. It's actually the path that I came through. So I'm particularly committed to it, understand it, appreciate it. And it was when I came to Ramesh after having spent, let's say, 4 or 5 years immersed in the top-down teachings of Lao Tzu and Ramana Maharshi, Nisargadatta Maharaj, Wei Wu Wei, and had these experiential shifts, these realizations, and this new way of knowing myself, such that a lot of peace was delivered. But I guess at that time it wasn't really clear that peace was what was most valuable, because the teachings were really talking about the shift and about oneness and non-separation in a way that sounded like it was all about an experiential oneness that did in fact set in. in in subtle forms of oneness most of the time, and occasionally with very peak experiences of oneness. But even the subtle forms of oneness, which were fairly consistent for several years, and as I said, you wake up in the morning knowing life from that perspective, go through the day knowing life from that perspective, and then go to sleep and know life in dreams from that same witnessing perspective, seeing the body as an object and not as the subject. In its subtle oneness or not so subtle oneness experiences, that was there, and so I was convinced that it was just a matter of that becoming more and more pronounced, more and more like the intense oneness experiences that left no sense of separation. So the subtle oneness experience seemed to be a hybrid of the knowing everything as arising within awareness on an unbroken basis, and yet still having a sense that I could experience the book as opposed to the tree. And so there was what felt like a hybrid experience. And I was just convinced that that still included too much of the person, because the body was still available as part of the experience, and certain thinking was still available. And so I thought the enlightenment must be even less of that, much more of the formless and much less of the person. And so what I assumed by the person was aspects of the human being that now I have no expectation of them changing or not being here. It seems actually in hindsight like a ludicrous assumption to have, that liberation is a movement further out into nothing, less and less of the person. And it's very clear to me now what is meant by less and less of the person, and it's very much not the physical or the emotional or the thoughts, but rather a very specific range of feelings and thoughts, a range of feelings and thoughts that refer to a me that is essentially the doer and attached to outcomes. A me that sees itself as an autonomous and insulated being that functions just because of its own choice. So the me, I mean, the best way I can think of putting it is it's a attitude, a psychological overlay of seeing oneself as separate and independent from life, which really means the chooser, the one in control. It creates an image, an appearance, a sense of an entity that decides what it does. That is what I now see as the person that dissolves. The person that, as liberation sets in more and more, there is less and less of. Not at all anything to do with, so I no longer see the person that dissolves to be anything to do with the dissolving of the body or the dissolving of the working mind thoughts. And so what happened when I met Ramesh was something that was in my seeking beforehand, because I remember times in the seeking where, when practical problems existed, problems that were creating a form of uncomfortableness, the seeking would always deal with it in terms of one's attitude. There was a very clear understanding, although maybe not as conscious as it became, that this uncomfortableness is because of the way you're thinking about the situation, about your attitude to what is going on. And from a young age, there was this sense that actually, if you don't have an issue with what happens, it's not really a problem. If you don't resist what is happening, it's not really a problem. If you don't have a story that turns something into a problem, it's not a problem. It just is something that you'll get over. That will, that not even that you'll get over, that doesn't need to be a problem. And so, while going through this process of seeing life differently, whenever a problem would arise because of circumstance, because of the way something unfolded, the way someone did something, my my system would turn to dealing with that in a way where the thinking, the story, the attitude was making it personal would be challenged. Something inside would say, it's not personal. And so there was this practical approach that dealt with the attitude simultaneous to and before meeting Ramesh. Then when I met Ramesh, the teaching he put forward brought everything back to peace of mind and put words in the teaching that says it's all about peace of mind. Enlightenment is continuous, unbroken peace of mind. And peace of mind means a comfortableness with yourself, a comfortableness with the other, and a comfortableness with life. So he was putting words onto what intuitively was happening when a problem would arise. It would be, it's only a problem if you make it into a problem. And when we stop making it into a problem, we find we're comfortable in life. And so the teaching said it's all about peace of mind. Liberation is the end of suffering. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. And what is suffering? Suffering is the attitude you have towards life based on seeing yourself as a separate, independent entity that is the doer of life. So seeing yourself as this doer of everything that happens through you. So all of your actions, all of your thoughts, all of your speech, all of your feelings and emotions, all seen as something you are in control of. And alongside that is the attitude that says my happiness is to be found in life looking perfect. So that's where suffering comes from. The attitude of doership that we project onto the other, that we see ourselves as the doer also, and this erroneous belief that my completeness, my happiness will be found only when life looks perfect. That's what suffering stems from, and it arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And so Ramesh said, let's keep this seeking practical, so you don't get lost in the notion that you are not the human being, that you are formless awareness, that life or enlightenment is about oneness. It's so easy to turn liberation into a whole lot of things that it's not about. And so that was received by me very well. It had sort of already, from a young age, actually, even in my before I was 10, I remember situations happening where I remember my attitude being involved in, and then something saying, it's forget about it. It's not such a big deal. But before, in those 4 years before Ramesh, actually what had set in, even though this movement was still happening, what had set in is the belief that liberation is about magic and about life being seen as the reality revealing itself. And I was convinced that reality was this experiential shift from knowing life as me and the tree and the table to knowing everything as one experientially. And so it was when I went and shared a peak experience of oneness with Ramesh, and I described it perfectly, because for 4 years the teachings were of the non-dual sort that had really essentially reconditioned my way of seeing life, so that even my thinking about things didn't allow any separation in. So any words that I used that by default implied duality would be corrected by a subsequent description that made it clear that I wasn't using that word in a way that implied duality. And so the description was given to Ramesh, and after the description, which I thought was pretty good, he said, "Roger, don't worry about it, that was just an experience." And nothing inside of me received that as meaning anything meaningful. It seemed like a misunderstanding, actually, of what I was putting forward, because I knew that it wasn't just an experience, it was very meaningful. It was playing into an overall shift that was happening for Roger as a seeker. So it wasn't just an experience. And yet, so I described it again, and once again at the end of my description, which I thought added to my already pretty good description, meaning I felt it adequately portrayed that this was an experiential and not intellectual revelation of life as a non-duality. And Ramesh again said, "Roger, don't worry about it, that was just experience." So I had one last crack at filling in any gaps, which really meant mostly I was just repeating myself because I didn't think there were many gaps to fill in. And again, "Roger, don't worry about it, that was just experience." Now, in hindsight, those were the best words he could have said. I don't think he meant it as absolutely as that, because I still say that that was very instrumental and was more than just experience, but was part of a very significant change that was happening for Roger the Seeker. However, what was needed at that point, and what was accurate, is don't mistake that experience. All of life is experience. It's never not experience. So don't single out that experience, which had some profound aspects to it and was, unusual and has a lot of qualities to it that, primarily because of the unusualness of them, because of the contrast between what was before and that experience itself, seemed very, very important. So Ramesh was essentially, don't single that out and think it's about that. It isn't about that. And he was so right, and I still say it. So I would reiterate, it wasn't about that. That was part of the change that was happening. It was significant. But that was just part of the change. It wasn't about that. And it took about 2 or 3 months of a craving for that experience to come back, which I felt was a deepening of the oneness that had been there for several years. And I wanted it to come back because I thought that was the movement of the deepening of oneness, and it will come back and stay on a permanent basis. And my assumption was, well, that's what we're looking for. Why? Because that's oneness. And it's pretty cool. In hindsight, I'm very glad that didn't set in for the rest of my life. It might have seemed cool as a temporary experience, but it may not have been that significant once it became standardized, once it became normal. Just like I've said recently, we might think that we really are looking to be able to manifest everything we want. And really that seems appealing to that person that feels like their happiness is to be found in outcomes. And truth be told, if you got that special power, such that you could manifest whatever you want, whenever you wanted it, that after 2 days it would probably be quite boring. You might be wishing for the mystery, the uncertainty of life to come back. And so in hindsight, I see that this idea that life as oneness, less and less person, more and more nothingness, was just an idea, was a belief that had been set in place. And furthermore, a lot of the components that presented and present in those peak experiences are, I would say, very significant revelations, sort of like behind the scenes tour, or if you have a working drawing of something mechanical, you sometimes have these exploded diagrams of an elbow or something, a join, and the exploded diagram shows you all the little bits and how they all join inside a join. And so a peak experience, I say, is a bit like one of those exploded diagrams that shows you something, but it's not how it's meant to be lived. You don't have the piece of equipment with that joint exploded. It doesn't work when the joint is exploded. That's a diagram to show you how it all works. And in practice, it needs to be constructed. So the diagram is a deconstructed version. And a peak experience is a bit like that. It's sort of like a deconstructed version of life, or it's a version of life that emphasizes a certain component that is always there, but in the deconstructed version, it is more subtle. And so maybe we need this peak experience to show us a component that is usually quite subtle in a non-subtle way, so we can appreciate it. And then when it goes back into its subtle form, we might be able to locate that aspect, that component that presented itself, had its day in the sun, had its 15 minutes on stage. And in that 15 minutes on stage, you got to see it relative to all these other components of life that it normally blends in so well with. And so then it comes back. So your behind the scenes tour is over, and you go and sit in the audience again, but with an appreciation of having seen things differently. So that's part of the value of these peak experiences. So remember, there are, what do we call it? Do we call them experiences or states? Now, so I would say states apply, I would use a state to describe when the sense of consciousness or the perceiver moves around and exists within a certain experience in a different form. So really you can have the experience of life, which really means, let's say, the experience of tables and chairs and other people and birds and dogs and trees and what have you, sky. So there's the experience of life. The experience of life that is perceived, let's say, through the body, or feels. There's the sense that it is being perceived through the body. So that is one state of consciousness. It is the experience of life, and a particular state of consciousness is present. And let's call that the ordinary, everyday state. Then you can have the same experience of life, but with the sense that what is perceiving it is not the body, mind, organism. So the experience of life is now created such that the subject, the pure subject, that which is real, that which is aware, that which I am, because even though when I say I am, I'm not really saying Roger, because in this number 2 state, the sense is, oh, I am, but I'm not Roger. But there is this undeniable sense, but what I am, let's say this formless awareness, it's the real. It's the subject. And that we can call, let's say, witnessing state, where there is no witnesser. So witnessing doesn't have to imply, in the same way that experience doesn't have to imply experiencer and object experienced. We can loosen up our word, or loosen up the definition of the word, and say experience can be the experience without an experiencer. And someone said, well, that can't be an experience then. That's reality, that's truth. Why? Just use the word experience. Isn't that what is here? Whether there's a sense of subject-object relationship or just knowing everything that is here, it is experience. It's only when we say experience means experiencer and object experienced that we can't call it experience. But what if we say experiencing is the falling away of the experiencer and the experienced? Then we just have experiencing. Life is experiencing. Not an experience, but experiencing. Just like saying there is no dancer dancing, there is just dancing. Dancing includes the dancer and the dance. So dancing is the collapsing of the separation of psychology that says there is a dancer doing a dance. And when that psychology collapses, we see there is just dancing happening, and dancing requires the dance and the dancer. You can't have dancing without the two, which really means not two, but one movement, which is why life is sometimes referred to as verbing rather than a noun and a verb. So speaking is happening. There's no speaker giving a speech, but rather speaking, which is the recognition that the speaker and the speak are never separate, are not two. And so experiencing can be the recognition that the experiencer and the experienced are one with each other, and there is just experiencing. So why not call life experience? So anyone who's out there going, it's not experience when reality is known, there is no subject, realize that's just your definition of the word experience, and you can change it. And then when I say experience, you go, yes, okay, now I get you. It's experiencing, no experiencer. Yes, so now we can call it experience. That I say that tongue in cheek because it's one of the things we don't realize when we get caught up on words, that we have rigidly cemented a definition that is our definition of that word. And when someone else uses the word differently, we say, oh no, that doesn't apply to the way you're using it. Well, change your definition and then it can apply. What that allows us to do is realize the relativeness, the untrueness of words, which means the untrueness of language, which means we can maybe find ourselves free from label and language and the separation that is created by our interpretation of how life is. So is it about oneness? The irony is that as we stop labeling things, a oneness experience can set in. As we stop seeing life as causal and time-bound, as we realize that what is aware is not the body is just an object, suddenly a oneness experience, a sense of oneness where we know ourselves as formless awareness, presents. And it's experiential, not intellectual. In fact, when it happens, we'll go, oh, this is not at all what I thought it was going to be. It's not at all how I interpreted the oneness. And yet, if the teachings interfere with our thinking sufficiently, the life experience gets re-rendered. And then there's even a sense, oh, I am not the body. That's not true, incidentally. That's just the rendered new experience or state, or experience with a particular state to it, feels like I am not the body. Don't take that as truth. Don't take any experience as truth. This is one of the big mistakes that keeps us believing that our experience at a certain time, which seems radical and therefore seems like this is it, is the truth, because the experience happens, it has a certain quality to it, it has certain characteristics to it, and then we say, this is what was revealed. The truth was revealed. Now, how do you know it was the truth? So a typical example of this is that the sense when the awareness aspect is revealed, and remember, that could be the peak experience I'm talking about, that is there to show us an aspect that is always there, but to show it in a pronounced way. And one of the common characteristics, I guess you could say, of a hallmark characteristic is the sense that what I am was never born, that what I am is eternal, what I am will exist or exists forever. So that will be part of our description when we are describing that state. Oh, I knew myself as formless and eternal, that which never dies. You go, really? Are you sure? How are you so sure? Well, it felt realer than real. That which never dies. In fact, what we're told in the teachings is that that is impersonal consciousness of Source, God. That this coming to know yourself is to know yourself as God. And so when it happens, there are so many characteristics that are experiential that we then fill in a whole lot of other bits based on what we were told. So if I told you, dig down 20 meters through this rock, so like digging a well, dig a well, and you'll come to water, right? Let's say this is a foreign concept to anyone on earth. They've never dug down and come to water. And I say, dig down and come to water. And that is the fountain of youth. That is the the river of the divine that no one knows about. And you have been chosen to receive this information. I'm a messenger from God. You shall dig, and you will find it hard, but you will persevere, and you will find the divine river of youth. And you shall drink from this river, and it will feel quenching, and that is the pure source of life. And so the person digs, and they get to 19.5 meters, and they have found obstacles, but they have persevered, and they have dug. And let's say in the description, it describes certain characteristics of how the water will emerge. All characteristics of how water emerges when you dig down to that depth. And so when the person gets there, as predicted, the water appears. And so there are so many characteristics that match the story, match the instruction. Remember the instruction about getting to the fountain of youth, or the river of youth. That when the person gets there, they are convinced beyond the shadow of a doubt, this is the river of youth. It might just be an everyday average aqueduct, an underground river that is part of the Earth's geography and is bound to be there when you get 20 meters down. And because it is something that was unknown, is where it was said to be, there is a belief that everything else that was said is truth. And so we then overlay that onto the experience. And so we know ourselves as God. Oh, I knew myself as God. That which was never born and will never die. And it requires some critical thinking skills to set in, and for us to then examine the experience and examine the beliefs we have and see if the experience actually confirms the content of the belief. And that requires us to have understood that experience, just like thoughts, are very deceiving. They are not reflections of truth. They're subjective. And we might say, no, but you see, that's why this was not an experience. This was not subjective. This was a knowing of life from the perspective of the absolute. Are you sure? Or was that what you were told as part of the river of youth description? No, but it felt absolute. Well, are you sure it didn't feel absolute because a more relative lens fell away? So if a more relative lens falls away, then it's going to feel less relative. And if you put the relative and the less relative next to each other, you could call it relative and absolute. Is it really absolute? If that is a relative lens and that too falls away, you might then find something less relative. And you might then go, oh, that wasn't the absolute. But I thought it was the absolute. Oh, I was mistaken. But I thought you said it, you were sure because the experience told you that it was the absolute. That it was God, that you were God, that you won't ever die. Are you sure? As we realize more and more how our thinking is very, very flawed, and that flawed thinking carries itself over into spiritual seeking, we start to let go of more and more beliefs. So in summary, because I've spoken for way too long probably, in summary, this talk is about the fact that there are these shifts. There are teachings that are profoundly designed in order to undo the blocks that are in the way, to bring about shifts. And the teachings are not the truth. They are a concept, not the truth. liberation, according to this concept, this framework, this teaching, and what is being put forward today, is not about the experience of oneness. That the end of separation doesn't mean an experience of oneness. Now, sure, an experience of oneness by default means the end of separation on an experiential level. And so then we say, yes, but doesn't this end of separation need to be experiential? Yes, but can there be another layer of experiential that doesn't need it to be a oneness experience? Can we have a deep knowing that I, even though I feel like I am separate, am not separate from life? Can that be a knowing that is experiential, that doesn't require a oneness experience to be there? And I say yes. And what would the alternative to a oneness experience? This deep knowing that is not a oneness experience. What is the alternative? It's an intellectual understanding that says, oh, intellectually, I understand. I read the paragraph that says we are not separate from life. We are all part of life. And someone might say, I get it. It's saying we're not separate from life. And yet, I don't have any sense of that being the case. Now, if we're looking for the sense of it being the case as the end of the sense of separation on an experiential level, of course, we'll say, I don't have any sense of it. We might get a sense of it on a different level to the sense of separation. However, if the understanding is just intellectual, which is a starting point, it needs to be understood intellectually. What is being said needs to be understood intellectually at first. If it is just intellectual, then we aren't going to have a sense of knowing it, even if that knowing isn't a oneness experience. I'm suggesting that the knowing might start off as a oneness experience. And then when Ramesh said to me, Roger, that's just an experience, it became clear that I was assuming enlightenment was a oneness experience. And he's saying enlightenment is the end of suffering. Isn't suffering part of the experience? Isn't suffering a sense of uncomfortableness with oneself? So if suffering is based on the belief in separation, and suffering is experiential, can't we say that we have an experiential understanding, meaning an understanding that is beyond the intellect, if the suffering dissolves? If peace of mind is revealed as that which is beyond the suffering, can't we then say that my understanding of oneness, my understanding that I am not separate from life, is experiential because the understanding has resulted in the end of suffering? And the end of suffering is experiential. It is a feeling of uncomfortableness. Suffering is a feeling, a sense of uncomfortableness. And the end of suffering is a change of the overall experience. And why would suffering indicate, when suffering ends, why would it indicate a deep understanding of the non-separateness of life? It indicates a deep understanding of the non-separateness of life because we come to see that suffering is based on the belief that I am a separate, independent entity, which basically means the one in control of my thinking, my actions. And the suffering is an attitude towards what happens in life, an attitude towards the functioning of the human being, such that there is an uncomfortableness whenever the outcome is painful. There is an uncomfortableness towards the other in the form of blame and hatred whenever the other delivers pain, because we see the other as a separate, independent entity that could have and should have acted differently. And the separation that falls away is the seeing them as separate from life on a deep, deep level, if we understand it deeply, we see that whatever comes out of someone's mouth is not their doing, but a happening as part of life happening. There is a deep sense that the words coming out of my mouth are a happening. The thoughts arising are a happening. And if that understanding is deep, then separation has fallen away. Not separation on an experiential level, but the attitudinal separation. That is the end of separation that leads to the experiential end of suffering. So keep bringing it back to what it's really about in practical terms. Who cares about oneness if suffering were to still exist? If you were still to find yourself uncomfortable with life? It's like, what I mean by that is, who cares about having all of the things that you would like in your life if suffering still existed? The only reason we think that being able to manifest what we want is valuable is because we believe, incorrectly I might add, that it would make us happy. Now, that's when we don't realize that unhappiness is suffering. So if we think, yes, what I really want, God, you're offering me one wish, I'll have my manifesting power, please, because then I can manifest anything that I want. And if, in fact, when we're manifesting whatever we want, we find ourselves uncomfortable, we would say in practical terms, what's the good of this? What's the good of this skill or this practice or this attribute? Who cares about manifesting because I still feel uncomfortable in life? And in the same way, who cares about oneness if suffering still exists? Who cares about witnessing if suffering still exists? Who cares about knowing oneself as formless awareness if suffering still exists? Sure, if knowing yourself as formless awareness meant the complete end of suffering, then maybe it starts to be reasonable. But what if knowing yourself as formless awareness without suffering is not as rich an experience, or not what the life experience is meant to be? Maybe the life experience is knowing yourself as the human being, free of suffering. So if someone is interested in oneness, I'd say, what if you can have happiness, which is what we're really looking for, the end of suffering? Because if you had oneness when suffering was there, after a while you'd say, well, what was all this talk about oneness? I'm still unhappy in life. Right? So I would say, what if you can have happiness without oneness, without experiential oneness? What came to me as my insight when what Ramesh was saying clicked, you're not looking for oneness, Roger. That was just an experience. What you're looking for is peace of mind. What occurred to me is that prior to the craving for that oneness experience to come back, I had peace of mind. And then the craving came back, which was suffering. And in a moment, it clicked. What Ramesh was saying is, Roger, enlightenment is not the oneness experience, so why do you crave it? And then I thought, what if he's right? What if enlightenment is not the oneness experience? Or what if enlightenment has nothing to do with light and knowing yourself as light that feels wonderful in those peak experiences? What if enlightenment is not that, and we keep thinking it is that? Then you're going to keep waiting for it, maybe missing what is just outside of your grasp, because you're waiting for something that enlightenment isn't. And as soon as we drop that, we find that enlightenment is right here. If that was the last form of suffering, that craving was the last form of suffering. And so in my experience, there was peace of mind. This experience of oneness in a very profound way happened. And then a craving for that to come back, which was suffering, expectation. And when it was seen, the remembrance, enlightenment is just the end of suffering. And that means the dropping of expectation. And what if the expectation that enlightenment is oneness experience is wrong? And it all happened magically. Of course it's wrong because it's creating my suffering. As soon as I drop the expectation for it, I have the peace of mind, which is the enlightenment. And I'm pleased to report that from that time on, which was, 2007, 2005 was that particular insight, peak experiences of oneness have not happened anywhere near in that profound fullness way that they did in that in early 2005. And I couldn't care less. I couldn't be happier. So experientially, I know that enlightenment has nothing to do with a oneness experience. It has everything to do with the end of suffering. Peace of mind. Simple peace of mind for the human being that continues to live as a body-mind organism, knowing themselves as separate from the table and the tree, while understanding, because of the revelations that had happened and the subtle witnessing or oneness that still exists, knowing that on another level, life experience is all one experience, that life is one big happening. And it is living as a human being separate from the table, the chair, and the other human beings in practice, in practical terms. I am not the other human being. Connected to a source, which is another way of saying a consciousness that functions through this body-mind organism and is the source of Roger, which means if you take this consciousness away, Roger ceases to have an existence. The experience where Roger is the body-mind organism at the center of the Roger experience, if you take consciousness away, that experience collapses. And so consciousness is the source of Roger. It is the same consciousness that is the source of everyone else. Now, whether it is linked and is coming from the same source is irrelevant. It's the same basic consciousness that functions through all human beings. All human beings have different brain structures that then create the different personalities, the different specific characteristics. But the consciousness, when the brain is not functioning, when the characteristics are forgotten, is the same sense of formless, unidentified, non-individuated I amness and awareness. So knowing myself as the human being, a human being which is conscious, which has consciousness flowing through it, allowing a personal consciousness experience to happen, and simultaneously being at peace because there is a deep knowing that whatever happens in life is a happening according to God's will and not my doing, is the radical shift that brings about an experiential change in the way we relate to what happens, in the way that we see the other and ourself, and most importantly, in the way that our attitude to all of that manifests. No longer an uncomfortableness with oneself, no longer the arising of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, and instead the living as the human being with unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance, because the circumstance is not resisted, but understood to be the unfolding of the story of life.